committed to preserving the vast customs of a vibrant cultural heritage.
Welcome to In Conversation. We come to you from Washington, D.C. My name is Aastha Verma.
And I'm Viraj Gandhi.
Viraj, it's great to have you back in the studio. The last time we taped, we had a great time.
We did. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
So I have to ask you, last weekend was our big snowfall here in the D.C. area. It was very pretty to look at, but, it was tough to get around, I think, a little bit for some folks.
Absolutely, especially for me. I had trouble getting around. But I'm always intrigued when it snows in the D.C. metro area. The reason being, I lived in New York. I grew up in New York, lived in Boston, spent a lot of time in Chicago, and snow is regular in those places. Here, I feel like people really take it to the extreme. Life stops. The grocery stores are packed, and people go and they, stock up on water and canned food and duct tape and things that, when we lived in New York, we didn't really do that. I mean, snow is snow. So it's always very interesting to see everybody freak out a little bit.
I have to agree with you. When I go to the grocery stores, it's always funny. You find the eggs, the milk, and the bread missing, and the toilet paper missing, of course, right? Those are the first four things to run out of the grocery store. So it makes you wonder, what do people do with those ingredients? Well, clearly they must be making French toast and spending a lot of time in the bathroom. Yeah, that's all I can come to a conclusion when it comes to the snow. But it was very pretty, and except for the aching backs people had trying to shovel themselves out, I actually enjoyed the snowfall, and I'm glad it wasn't just a smattering. It was actually a nice-sized snowfall. It
was. It was a little slushy, a little on the slushy side, but it was very nice, and it was definitely makes it feel like winter, especially since we've been having this up and down with the weather. One day it's 60 degrees, and the next day it's 40 degrees. So it was nice to see the snow.
It was, of course, gone like the next day. You had barely any of it left, but I certainly enjoyed it. But, I guess if you're Neil Kashkari, you like to get away and really get away from everything, the hustle bustle, and surround yourself with nature and probably the snow as well. Did you see this article in the Washington Post about him?
I did, and I think it's extremely intriguing.
So for most of you that don't remember Neil Kashkari, if you remember the $700 billion stimulus plan, we heard a lot about Hank Paulson, who was the person who was assigned to distribute those funds. The number 2 guy there was Neil Kashkari, and we, of course, in the Indian community really noticed him because here's an Indian face, and yet he's responsible for so much. But in this week's post, there's an article on him and how he's just trying to get away from life. He's trying to get away from the hustle and bustle of D.C. Apparently that $700 billion really stressed him out.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine. I think the article called it Washington Detox. And I think that's really interesting, and I give him a lot of credit for being able to step away and do that. I think he probably looked at his life and saw time passing by, and he wanted to spend some more time with his family.
There's a devastating quote by his wife in the article saying that they communicated so little that they were basically dead to each other. That tells you that that kind of stress is really taking an impact on your life. But talk about getting away, folks. Here he is out in someplace in Northern California, far away from civilization. He built a shed, and he lives in a cabin. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. And I think it takes a big person to be able to step away from that. I'll be honest, I don't think if I had the job that he did, as stressful as it would be very hard for me to detach myself from something like that. Because it's a great job. It's an appointment by the president.
But you know what? I think sometimes the best vacation is just to take that BlackBerry and turn it off. Most of us, they talk about how, the BlackBerry is the one habit that the former Treasury Department official has not been able to quit. Well, then you really haven't gone very far, right? If you still have that leash on you, then you're pretty much still on the job.
Yeah. So you're saying that he should have probably found a cabin with no
signals.
No signals.
Or at least chuck the BlackBerry away. Leave it at home. Don't take it with you.
I agree. But I think the detoxing is done because he's now found a job with PIMCO.
That's right. I did hear about this. He's now found, of course, he used to work for Goldman Sachs, if many of you will remember. So no surprise, PIMCO, which is an investment firm, has picked him up to start a new series of investment firms. So anyone who has money in their wallets should probably pay attention to that and see where they can put those dollars next. But moving on, folks, this was also a big week for President Obama because, of course, he had the big speech about Afghanistan. After weeks, I would say months of waiting on a decision for Afghanistan, many of us watched that speech that night and felt very, lifted, but at the same time, There weren't that many specifics in there.
No.
He basically said, yes, we're leaving, but not for a while. We'll still be there for some time. And of course, this week, Time magazine came out, and this headline really says it all. It's his war now. I mean, just like we said for President Bush, Iraq was his war. Afghanistan has turned into President Obama's war. He'll be responsible ultimately for the legacy, whatever it turns out to be, for this war and for his decision to send 30,000 extra troops. I
don't think he provided any specifics because I don't think that they have a plan. And shortly after his speech, which I believe was last Tuesday or a couple Tuesdays ago, his approval rating dropped below 50%. So do you think the two of them are tied with more troops, and now that he's inherited the war, that his approval ratings are now...
Absolutely. In fact, I was just going to make that point that, if you look at when we started being in war, we started right after 9/11. That was 2001. And he's talking about bringing these troops back 2011.
Right.
That makes this almost a 10-year war.
It's a decade.
It's a decade. And yet, if you step back and say, okay, what have we accomplished in this decade-long war? And you can't really point to anything substantial. You have a country in Iraq that's not fully functioning the way that you would like it to. You cannot leave that country just yet because the internal infrastructure isn't quite there the way it needs to be. Here you have Afghanistan, where terrorism activities are still happening there. I mean, maybe you can make the point that they've subsided, but you have not yet obliterated Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, and you still have to figure out how those internal factions really cooperate or don't cooperate with each other. I don't think he has the choice to be able to leave immediately, but the fact is it just clearly points out that you cannot fix these problems, not in 5 years, not in
Absolutely.
10 years. These are problems that have been around for decades, and they'll probably continue to be there for decades. At what point do we just say enough is enough? It's time for us to come home.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think when he was campaigning, he talked about this removal plan from Iraq and Afghanistan, but when you're now in office, which obviously President Obama is, it's very difficult because it's a double-edged sword. If you bring the troops home, then you risk Afghanistan flaring up into another hotspot of terrorist activities and potential problems for that region and for us, the U.S. But if you send troops there, there's also that aspect of, well, are we continuing the war, and how much longer is it going to go on for? So quite frankly, I think it's a very hard decision that he made. That's why it took so long. And secondly, I don't think that they have a plan because there really isn't a good way to define a plan when you have this type of problem.
Is it just me, or did he come across somewhat Bush-esque in his decision? I mean, when President Bush decided to send more troops, it was the surge, and to some degree it worked. So you can't discredit President Bush from taking that option. But at the same time, this is almost the same strategy. This is, okay, we're not quite getting to that level of success in Afghanistan. Let's throw more at the problem. Let's throw more troops at this problem. The American public, they're worn out with that kind of a strategy, and you're not guaranteed any form of success there either. So I think, this is it. I hope for